Hey, welcome back to the Adult Bible Study at the First Baptist Church of Grace City. My name is Charles. I'm one of our associate pastors, and today we're going to be diving back into Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 11 through 22. I hope you enjoy today's Bible study. I want to start off today with a little bit of gratitude and love for Bible translators, because Hebrew and Greek are both extremely difficult languages. The Hebrew in Ecclesiastes is also very difficult, and often translators are having to make judgment calls as to what the passage says and then translate it accordingly. This is one of the reasons reading multiple translations is an advantage, because sometimes different translations can give different nuances to specific passages, as is the case with Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 11. Because in this, we have two different translations here, the ESV and the CSB. And we'll notice a very key difference with these two translations. The ESV translates it, wisdom is good with an inheritance, whereas the CSB translates, wisdom is as good as an inheritance. There is two different things being said. One is a comparison, as good as. The other is saying that in unison with, wisdom is good with or alongside an inheritance. I'm going to dive into this a little bit more here in just a second, but I wanted to start off this lesson by just bringing two things to our attention. One, gratitude for Bible translators, because there's many who do a fantastic job translating and give us beautiful translations that are easy for us to read. And so we need to put our hats off to them, and we need to be people who are serious about the Word and serious about reading in multiple translations, not just sitting in one, but reading multiple to get the nuances and the differences between the passages so that we can rightly do the best that we can to divide what the Word of God is saying to us. Now, let's dive into our passage for the day. Using the CSB, because that is the translation that is used primarily by Lifeway, and the translation that our church, First Baptist Grace City, uses. That's what I'm going to be teaching out of today, the CSB, and it says that wisdom is as good as an inheritance. But how does wisdom relate to an inheritance? Now, I use the word relate because of what we just talked about with the difference in translation, meaning wisdom is as good as, the comparison, or wisdom is good with, in the unison of. And to understand the relation of wisdom to the word inheritance, it is important to understand the inheritance in ancient Jewish culture. An inheritance is a hereditary property or possession that will be handed down. The term also means inalienable and points to the inability for someone to miss out on their inheritance because it is something passed down by law and understood to be supremely the Lord's, but allocated to His people. This comes from an understanding of Numbers 18, 20 through 21. The Lord told Aaron, "You will not have an inheritance in their land." And this is talking to the Levites. "There will be no portion among them for you. I am your portion and your inheritance among the Israelites. Look, I have given the Levites every tenth in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work they do, the work in the tent of meeting. It is the Lord's. All the possessions within Israel are the Lord's, which means He divvies them up as He pleases. But He's not, in this scenario, giving anything to the Levites because they get the tenth that is brought to the temple as their portion, because their portion is the Lord Himself and what is the Lord's. As in this case, since as good as could mean with, as we've already noted, or the comparison as good as, it can relate in one of two ways. One, as a comparison, and it shows that wisdom is supremely from the Lord and an inalienable possession given to His people, or Second, an inheritance is desirable, but if unaccompanied by wisdom, will not get you through adversities. Since, as we'll see in a moment, this section ties with verse 14, which deals with adversities. Or a third option is a combination of options 1 and 2, which is my personal opinion, since wisdom does come from God, and it would be an inalienable to his people who fear him, since fear of the Lord is its beginning, and it is wisdom that helps you get through adversities. Thus, it is an advantage to those who see the sun. That is all humanity. Anybody who lives under the sun, which would be any human being living on the earth. But why is wisdom an advantage? And this is because wisdom considers God, knowing that he is good and righteous, hating sin, and ultimately will deal with all wickedness. Wisdom thus leads one to realize their place within God's grand story, which we will dive into a little bit more in detail in verse 14. So let's dive into verse 12 so we can get there. Because wisdom is protection as silver is protection. Why in the world is wisdom being compared here to silver? Well, the Hebrew word for silver also is the word for money or wealth. Understanding this helps us to see the true intent behind this comparison of wisdom and silver. Because the idea is that money or wealth has a protective power for those who possess it. And the same is true for wisdom, but to a greater degree, because the advantage of knowledge is that knowledge and wisdom, which are being used synonymously here, preserve the life of its owner. Not only does wisdom provide protection, but it also has the ability to preserve life of the one who possesses it. However, life and everything is ultimately in the hands of God. Verse 13, how does the teacher Solomon show his readers that everything is ultimately in God's hands? Do two things. The first is to consider the works of God. And the second is a question which asks them to do something simple. Who can straighten out what he has made crooked? That he being God. Who can straighten out what God has made crooked? All aspects of life, even the crooked and painful parts, are under God's control, is what this passage is ultimately saying. They are subject to his will. We may try to fight it and attempt to change it, but ultimately no amount of wisdom, wealth, or level of human authority can effect change to God's sovereign activity. Because no one can straighten out what God has made crooked. Which is why the teacher Solomon tells us in the next verse to enjoy the good times and trust him in the adverse times, in those challenging times. So let's dive in and see how this plays out. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider God has made the one that is the prosperity and joy, as well as the other, the days of adversity, so that no one can discover anything that will come after him. What is Solomon telling his readers? That both prosperity and adversity, the days of prosperity and the days of adversity, have their uses. Prosperity leads to joy, so be joyful, while adversity draws one's attention to the realities of life in a broken world and leads one to a life of trust. That is, if you do truly trust in the sovereignty of God, it leads us to that kind of trust. Since both are under his will, God has made both the one that is prosperity and joy, and the other, adversity and both are under the will of God. And the constant fluctuation between them keeps us from guessing at the incomprehensibility and the inscrutability of God, which are beyond our finite understanding, because no one can discover anything that will come after Him. This should push us to trust even more, knowing that God in heaven is in control. It is His world and His plan that He is bringing to fruition for the good of those who trust Him, as Paul says in Romans chapter 8. But despite our trust, the reality is we will still struggle at times, just as Solomon does, with the futility and seeming unfairness of God's distribution of prosperity and adversity. And this is what we see in this next verse. So let us dive in and see how Solomon the teacher wrestles through this struggle. In my futile life, why in the world does Solomon call his life futile? Well, due to his struggles with the righteous perishing in spite of their righteousness, and the wicked living long in spite of their evil, he is faced with the seeming injustice of this, and he warns against two opposing moral dangers. In this struggle, he sees the route that people go, and it's one of two ways. And so he teaches based on what he sees that people do. Verse 16, don't be excessively righteous and don't be overly wise. What is it that the teacher is recommending here? Well, at first glance, it could be interpreted as an indifference to morality. Don't be excessively righteous. Don't be too good. But that's not the case. Don't be excessively righteous should be taken as a statement of irony, similar to saying don't play the righteous individual. It's a condemnation of self-righteous behavior. The same can also be true of don't be overly wise, which is a condemnation of pretending to be wise to garner a reputation as a wise individual. This is the first moral danger in the face of injustice, to move to a self-righteous position which views yourself as better. And why should you destroy yourself with that self-righteous behavior towards others? But then the second moral danger, don't be excessively wicked and don't be foolish. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what is the teacher recommending here? And at first glance, Solomon appears to be saying that sinning in moderation is acceptable because we're not to be excessively wicked. But what he's really saying is don't capitulate to sin. Don't slide into saying, well, if I can't get away from it, I might as well just do what the world is doing and continue into wickedness. What he's doing here is he's recognizing that wickedness is a fact of the human experience. We understand this in part because of verse 20, which says, there is certainly no one righteous on earth who does good and never sins. He understands that there is nobody who is without sin. And so therefore we should not be excessively wicked because we will be wicked at some time. So then what is the right path? If we shouldn't be self-righteous and we shouldn't capitulate to sin, then what is the right path? And the path is to go between these extremes. We should shun self-righteousness, yet grasp a hold of righteousness and wisdom, while also not allowing our sinful nature to slip from our hands and run wild. How do then we accomplish this? Well, the only way to accomplish this is through fear of God, which is what Proverbs 1:7, one of the teacher's proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And again, knowledge and wisdom are used synonymously, often in wisdom literature. And it tells us that the beginning of this knowledge, the beginning of wisdom, is to fear God. This is why those who fear God end up with both of them, seeing both the danger to capitulate to sin and the danger to slide into self-righteousness, and walking between them through the awe-inspired reverence for God and His majesty. For the one who fears God will end with both of them. Through this passage, Solomon has shown his readers the need for wisdom due to the dangers and the consequences that befall us during the human experience. And in the next section, he continues to show us our need for wisdom. Ecclesiastes 19 through 22. Wisdom makes the wise person stronger than 10 rulers of a city. How does wisdom make the wise person stronger than these 10 rulers of a city? Well, this ties back to the previous verse because wisdom originates with the fear of God, as we've already seen from Proverbs 1:7. It originates with the infinite God, and therefore even the collective wisdom of 10 rulers of a city, which stands for a group of experienced leaders. Their collective wisdom pales in comparison to the wisdom that is found by the fear of God. This is especially important in light of the current world we live in, which often tries to discredit the Bible, saying it is old-fashioned and outdated. Let us remember where wisdom is found, and even when the world might rage against us, Lord, give us the strength and fortitude in your word to stand against the collective wisdom of our day as we cling to the fear of the Lord and trust in your word. This leads us to the next verse, which brings us forward a truth that should sting us and remind us of how easily we can slide into self-righteousness. Verse 20, there is certainly no one righteous on earth who does good and never sins. There is not a righteous person on the face of the earth. This verse is cast in an emphatic, pointing to the universality of the truth. There is no one who is righteous, and covers both the acts of intentionality and our failures to act when good is needed. Because there's no one on earth who does good, that is, does good all the time, and never sins. Our sinfulness is seen most clearly in our speech, which is why we end our section today talking about the way that we speak with others. Verse 21, don't pay attention to everything people say, or you may hear your servant, that is, you may hear even those who should speak well of us, send fiery darts that cut deep and disturb our peace, because they curse us. For in your heart, you know that many times you yourself have cursed others. It's not just our servants. It's not just those who should think well of us. We don't need to pay attention to other people because we ourselves know exactly the kind of people that we are, and we know that we have cursed others, just as others have often cursed us. In the end, what we must do is we must seek wisdom which originates with the infinite God through the fear of God. We must trust His unfailing and unchanging nature. We must trust His sovereign plan, which has woven together both prosperity and adversity, which makes it impossible to see and know His inscrutable, unsearchable plan, all the while knowing He went to great lengths to create us and then to purchase us back from sin and death through the death of Jesus Christ, the righteous, who is the only individual who does not fit into this category, that there is no one righteous on earth, because Jesus Christ did live a perfectly righteous life. And when we have faith in Him, it counts as righteousness alongside of Him. And He adopts us into His family forevermore. My challenge for us as we leave this study today and we go throughout our week is to take the joys that God gives you and enjoy them, because He has given them to you. And when adversity comes, lean into His loving arms, knowing they became nail-scarred for your sake, so that you might trust Him with your entire life.